Throughout the annals of history, there have been countless emperors, kings, and conquerors. The vast majority of them sought power for power's sake, driven by an insatiable thirst for glory, boundless wealth, and the satisfaction of their own selfish ambitions. But there was one man who stood at the absolute summit of the world, wielding absolute authority over the life and death of millions, who nevertheless considered this supreme power not as a divine gift, but as a heavy and exhausting burden. Marcus Aurelius. He is known as the philosopher on the throne, the last of the 5 good emperors. He governed Rome during the epoch of its maximum zenith, yet his reign was far from a golden age of peace. It was a dark era, defined by interminable wars, monstrous plagues, violent rebellions, and devastating natural catastrophes. Destiny itself seemed determined to test his fortitude, forcing a man who yearned only for the quiet, contemplative life of a scholar to spend his finest years in the saddle, commanding iron legions upon the savage frontiers of the empire. This narrative is not merely a chronicle of military triumphs or shrewd political maneuvers. It is a deep immersion into the inner sanctuary of a man who waged the most difficult battle of all, the relentless battle against himself. How did he maintain his sanity when the known world seemed to crumble around him? What occupied the mind of the master of the universe as he sat in total solitude within a freezing military tent, surrounded by the dark, barbarian forests? The answers to these profound questions were preserved in his personal diary, a journal he wrote not for the eyes of posterity, but strictly for his own soul. These intimate writings, discovered only after his death, would eventually become one of the greatest and most enduring books in the history of humanity. This is an account of Stoicism, not as an abstract philosophical theory, but as a practical, vital weapon for survival. It speaks of a man who learned to remain kind in the midst of absolute cruelty, tranquil in the very center of chaos, and profoundly free while living as a captive to his own duty. It is a story of how the fading twilight of one great man became the twilight of the greatest empire in history. The Roman Empire in the 2nd century AD was at the zenith of its power. It was the epoch of the Pax Romana, the Roman peace. The frontiers were firmly secured by the legions. Within the empire, law and order reigned supreme. Commerce flourished, and cities from Britannia to Syria enjoyed the blessings of civilization. Aqueducts, bathhouses, theaters, and paved roads. The historian Edward Gibbon would later write that if a man had to choose in which era to be born, he would undoubtedly choose the period of the reigns of the Antonines. It seemed that this golden age would last forever. It was precisely in this stable and prosperous world that, on April 26th, in the year 121 AD, a boy named Marcus Annius Verus was born in Rome. He came from a noble and wealthy family, though not an imperial one. His ancestors originally hailed from Hispania, Spain, and through loyal service and fortunate marriages, they had managed to enter the highest Roman aristocracy. Marcus's childhood was privileged, but not without its clouds. His father died when the boy was only 3 years old. Marcus was adopted by his grandfather, an influential senator, who took charge of his upbringing. Roman education at that time was strict and comprehensive, but Marcus stood out from his peers. He was a serious, quiet, and reflective child for his age. He did not care for noisy games. He preferred books and conversations with his teachers. His destiny was sealed by a fateful encounter with Emperor Hadrian. Hadrian was one of the most cultured yet complex rulers of Rome, a tireless traveler, an aesthete, and a lover of Greek culture. He had no children of his own and was anxiously searching for a worthy successor. He often visited the house of Marcus's grandfather and took notice of the young boy. What impressed Hadrian was not Marcus's childish beauty, but his exceptional, almost disarming honesty and frankness. The emperor, accustomed to the flattery and lies of courtiers, gave him a nickname. Instead of his name Verus, true, he jokingly called him Verissimus, the most truthful. This nickname stuck with him for a long time. Hadrian saw something in that child that made him alter the destiny of the empire for decades to come. In the year 138, when Hadrian's health deteriorated and death became inevitable, the emperor set in motion a highly complex dynastic maneuver. His first adopted son and heir had died suddenly. The empire was on the brink of a succession crisis. Hadrian needed someone reliable. His choice fell upon the respected senator Titus Aurelius Antoninus, a man of impeccable reputation, who was already 51 years old. Hadrian adopted Antoninus and declared him his heir, but with one harsh and unyielding condition. Antoninus himself had to immediately adopt two youths, the 7-year-old son of the deceased heir, Lucius Verus, and the 17-year-old Marcus Annius Verus. Thus, overnight, the destiny of the young Marcus was decided for him. He learned that he was destined to become the master of the world. But his reaction to this news astonished his contemporaries. Instead of joy or triumph, he felt terror and a profound sadness. Historians write that upon learning of his adoption, he left his mother's house weeping, understanding that his quiet, private life was over forever. He had seen Hadrian's court from the inside. He knew that absolute power is not a gift, but a crushing burden, full of dangers, hypocrisy, and solitude. He did not want to rule. He wanted to learn. Upon moving to the imperial palace on the Palatine Hill, Marcus took the name Marcus Aelius Aurelius Verus. He became Caesar, the heir to the throne. His adoptive father, now Emperor Antoninus Pius, the Pious, turned out to be a wise and kind mentor. He did not view Marcus as a rival, but groomed him as a partner. The next 23 years of Antoninus Pius's reign were the most peaceful period in Roman history. And for Marcus, it was a time of long, meticulous preparation. He received the finest education money could buy. The best rhetoricians and orators of the empire were brought to him, such as the famous Marcus Cornelius Fronto, with whom Marcus forged a tender friendship and a correspondence that survives to this day. Fronto taught him the art of the word, attempting to make him a great orator. But Marcus's heart lay elsewhere. At around 12 years of age, he became impassioned with philosophy. It was not merely a teenage hobby, it was a passion that bordered on fanaticism. He began to dress in a rough Greek cloak, to sleep on the bare floor, and to eat simple food, imitating the asceticism of the ancient philosophers. It took great effort for his mother to convince him to sleep at least on animal skins, so as not to ruin his health, which was already fragile. Marcus did not seek abstract truths in philosophy, but a guide for life, a way to forge his spirit. The decisive moment in his spiritual formation was his introduction to the doctrine of the Stoics. His teacher, Junius Rusticus, a stern and direct man, gave him a copy of the Discourses of Epictetus. Epictetus was not a wealthy Roman. He was a lame, impoverished former slave who taught that true freedom is found only within ourselves. The teachings of Epictetus shook the heir to the throne. The former slave taught the future emperor the principal truth of Stoicism. In the world, there are things that depend on us, our thoughts, our actions, our attitudes, and things that do not depend on us, fame, wealth, health, the opinions of others. Happiness and peace can only be found by focusing on the former and accepting the latter as inevitable. You are a little soul carrying around a corpse, Epictetus used to say. For Marcus, this was a revelation. He understood that even on the throne, surrounded by flattery and luxury, he could remain free if he preserved the purity of his reason. Stoicism gave him the tools to deal with fear, anger, and the temptations of power. He learned to view his future role as emperor not as a privilege, but as a duty, a service to society, akin to the service of a soldier or a bee in the hive. Years passed. Antoninus Pius grew old. Marcus, who had married his daughter Faustina, became his right hand, practically a co-regent. He handled administration, the courts, and finances, mastering the incredibly complex machinery of governing a giant empire. He never left Italy, unlike Hadrian. He was a desk worker, an intellectual who spent his days among documents and his nights among books. It seemed the transition of power would be smooth and peaceful. The empire prospered, the borders were quiet, the treasury was full. In the year 161, Antoninus Pius passed away peacefully at his villa after eating Alpine cheese. His final word, the password for the night guard, was equanimitas, equanimity, or peace of mind. Marcus Aurelius, at the age of 40, became Emperor of Rome. He was a mature, prepared, and wise ruler, the ideal incarnation of the Platonic dream of the philosopher on the throne. It seemed the Golden Age would continue and shine even brighter. No one, least of all Marcus himself, suspected that the death of Antoninus Pius marked the end of the era of tranquility. Destiny, of which the Stoics spoke so often, had prepared a terrible test for the philosopher. Ahead lay not philosophical debates, but 19 years of continuous nightmare, wars, plagues, betrayals, and blood. And his very first decision on the throne was a step that surprised everyone. On March 7th, in the year 161 AD, Marcus Aurelius assumed supreme power over the Roman Empire. The Senate, as was customary, immediately offered him all the titles and powers that the late Antoninus Pius had possessed. Marcus became Augustus, Pontifex Maximus, and commander-in-chief. It seemed the order of things was unshakable. But the first decision of the new emperor left the Roman elite in a state of shock and bewilderment. Marcus Aurelius refused to accept power alone. He declared before the Senate that he would only accept being emperor on one condition: if his adoptive brother, Lucius Verus, received rights and titles absolutely equal to his own. The senators were stunned. The Roman Republic had once been governed by 2 consuls, but the Roman Empire had always been a monarchy. The principle of singular command was considered the guarantee of stability. Dividing supreme power seemed the perfect recipe for civil war. Why did Marcus do this? After all, the law did not oblige him to share the throne. Hadrian had adopted them both, but it was Marcus whom he had groomed as successor. Lucius was 8 years younger, more frivolous, and possessed no governing experience. Cynical politicians looked for hidden motives, but the answer most likely lay in Marcus's philosophy. It was an act of Stoic justice and filial duty. He had promised Hadrian and Antoninus to take care of his brother, and he kept his word, even when no one compelled him to do so. Furthermore, it is possible that he, the man carrying a corpse, felt that the weight of power was too great for one set of shoulders alone. Thus, for the first time in history, 2 emperors reigned in Rome, the 2 Augusti, Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus. They were polar opposites. Marcus, ascetic, thin, eternally immersed in work or books, hating pomp and flattery. Lucius, a tall, blonde, handsome athlete, a lover of banquets, chariot races, actresses, and wine. But contrary to fears, no enmity arose between them. Lucius, understanding his brother's intellectual and moral superiority, voluntarily accepted the role of the junior emperor, obeying Marcus in all important matters. The beginning of their joint rule was marked by lavish games and distributions of money to the people. It seemed the golden age was continuing, but it was only the calm before the storm. Barely had the funeral ceremonies for Antoninus Pius ended when nature, as if in league with destiny, struck the first blow. In the autumn of 161, the Tiber, the main artery of Rome, overflowed its banks. It was not a simple flood. It was a catastrophe of biblical proportions. The murky, turbulent waters inundated the lower areas of the city, destroying houses, temples, and bridges. But the most terrible devastation occurred in the port area and the warehouses. The water destroyed the gigantic grain reserves kept to feed the million-strong population of Rome. After the water came hunger. Drowned animals, corpses rotting in the water, and decomposing grain poisoned the air and the water. Disease broke out. The Roman plebs, hungry and frightened, began to murmur. In such a situation, any other ruler might have panicked or sent troops to suppress the riots. But Marcus Aurelius acted as a Stoic. He did not complain about fate, nor did he look for culprits. He accepted the catastrophe as a fact that had to be dealt with. He and Lucius personally led the rescue efforts. They opened the imperial granaries, distributing the remaining grain. They used their personal funds to buy food in other provinces and bring it to Rome. Marcus sold jewels from the imperial treasury, golden tableware, silks, and gems to raise money and help the victims. He showed himself not as a master, but as the first servant of the state. The crisis was mitigated, but the shadow of misfortune had already fallen over his reign, and the water had not yet receded from the streets of Rome when a far more terrible misfortune arrived. From the east, from distant Parthia, Rome's eternal and dangerous rival, came horrific news. The Parthian king Vologases IV, taking advantage of the death of the old emperor Antoninus, decided that Rome was weak. His troops invaded Armenia, a Roman protectorate. They massacred the Roman garrison there and placed their own candidate on the throne. The Roman governor in Syria, the legate Severianus, an arrogant and inexperienced man, thought he would easily deal with the barbarians. He moved his legion into Armenia but fell into a trap at Elegia. It was a massacre. An entire Roman army was surrounded and annihilated down to the last man. Severianus committed suicide. The Parthians, drunk on victory, hurled themselves upon Syria, sacking the richest cities of the east. The Pax Romana, the Roman peace that had lasted more than 40 years, collapsed overnight. Marcus Aurelius, the pacifist emperor who had never seen war and only dreamed of books, found himself at the head of a state dragged into a massive military conflict. He had to act. He made a strategic decision. Marcus remained in Rome to govern the state, rebuild the city after the flood, and secure the rear. And to the war, he sent his co-regent, Lucius Verus. This decision was not dictated solely by necessity. Marcus understood his brother's psychology. Lucius was young, thirsty for glory, and bored in Rome under Marcus's strict supervision. War gave him the opportunity to prove himself. Moreover, Marcus surrounded the inexperienced Lucius with his best generals, such as Avidius Cassius and Statius Priscus. These were old wolves, professionals who were to actually command the troops, while Lucius played the role of emperor-commander. Lucius Verus set out for the east with pomp and luxury, but his behavior along the way alarmed Marcus. Lucius advanced slowly, stopping in every Greek city for banquets and amusements. Upon reaching Antioch, he established his headquarters there, which resembled a spa resort more than a military camp. While the legions under the command of Marcus Aurelius's experienced generals marched through deserts and mountains fighting the Parthians, Emperor Lucius passed the time in the company of the famous beauty Panthea. He shaved his golden beard in the Oriental fashion and enjoyed life. However, the Roman military machine, tuned and disciplined, did its job. Marcus's generals, formerly subordinate to Lucius, won victory after victory. They expelled the Parthians from Armenia and invaded Mesopotamia. In the year 165, the legions of Avidius Cassius took and burned Seleucia and Ctesiphon, the two capitals of the Parthian Empire. It was a grandiose triumph. Parthia was humiliated. Rome demonstrated its invincibility once again. In the year 166, Lucius Verus and Marcus Aurelius celebrated a magnificent triumph in Rome. Both emperors, wearing laurel wreaths, rode along the Via Sacra in a chariot to the roaring ovation of the crowd. It seemed the streak of bad luck was over. The flood forgotten, the enemy defeated, the empire strong and rich once again. Marcus received the titles of Armeniacus and Parthicus. But no one that day, looking at the shining legions returning from the east, knew that along with the gold, the slaves, and the glory, they had brought to Rome something invisible and lethal, something that would kill more Romans than all Parthian arrows combined. The soldiers brought with them the plague. The epidemic, later called the Antonine Plague, most likely smallpox, broke out among the troops during the siege of Seleucia. The soldiers, returning home, spread the contagion throughout the empire, from Syria to the Rhine. It was the beginning of the end of the Golden Age. Marcus Aurelius, standing in the triumphal chariot, did not yet know that it would fall to him to be not only the ruler, but the grave digger of millions of his subjects, and the witness to the slow and agonizing death of the world he loved so much. The year 166 AD should have been the year of Rome's greatest triumph. Parthia had been crushed, the borders expanded, and the two emperors, Marcus and Lucius, bathed in the love of the people. But history played a cruel joke on Rome. The legions returning from the east carried a ticking time bomb in their bodies. The epidemic that passed into history as the Antonine Plague began, according to legend, when a Roman soldier accidentally opened a golden chest in the sacked temple of Apollo in Seleucia, releasing a poisonous vapor. In reality, it was most likely smallpox, a disease against which the population of Europe at that time had absolutely no immunity, and it spread with terrifying speed. First, the soldiers fell ill. The army, guarantor of the empire's security, began to melt away before everyone's eyes. Then the disease leapt to the cities. Rome, a metropolis of 1 million inhabitants with its overcrowding and lack of hygiene, became a giant morgue. The famous physician Galen, personal doctor to Marcus Aurelius, left us chilling descriptions of the symptoms. Fever, a black rash covering the entire body, coughing up blood, and an unbearable stench emanating from the dying. The mortality rate was monstrous. At the peak of the epidemic, up to 2,000 people died a day in Rome. Carts could not keep up with removing the bodies. They were thrown into massive mass graves or burned on pyres right in the streets, poisoning the air with the smoke of burning flesh. The empire began to crumble from within. Villages emptied. Fields were left unsown because there was no one to work them. Commerce halted. Tax revenues plummeted, and the state apparatus was paralyzed as scribes, praetors, and senators died. It was a social collapse. The people, gripped by terror, looked for culprits. A witch hunt began. The wrath of the crowd fell upon the Christians, accused of enraging the ancient gods by refusing to offer sacrifices. Marcus Aurelius, as Pontifex Maximus, was forced to sanction the persecutions, attempting to appease the gods and calm the people. This remains the darkest stain on his reputation. But for him, it was not an act of cruelty. It was an act of state duty, an attempt to restore the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods. Marcus Aurelius faced this apocalypse with the same stoic calm with which he had faced the flood. He did not flee the plague-ridden city for safe villas, as many aristocrats did. He stayed in Rome. He personally attended the funerals of common citizens, something unheard of for an emperor. He issued decrees forbidding the burial of people within the city walls to halt the contagion. He paid for the burial of the poor from the public treasury. In his meditations, he wrote during this time, "Death smiles at us all. All a man can do is smile back." For him, the plague was part of nature, an inevitable process that had to be accepted without losing human dignity. But misfortunes never come alone. While Rome writhed in the agony of the plague, its enemies smelled blood. News that the Roman legions were dying reached the savage forests of the north. The Germanic tribes, Marcomanni, Quadi, Iazyges, who for centuries had been held back by the fear of Roman power, understood that their hour had come. In the year 167, the unthinkable happened. A massive horde of barbarians broke through the Danube frontier. The Roman defense, weakened by disease, crumbled. The barbarians crossed the Alps and invaded Italy itself. For the first time in nearly 300 years, since the invasion of the Cimbri and Teutons, the foot of the enemy trod upon sacred Italic soil. They besieged the rich commercial city of Aquileia, perpetrating a massacre in its surroundings. Panic in Rome was absolute. The people thought the end of the world had arrived. The empire was cracking. Marcus Aurelius had no choice. He, a philosopher who hated violence, had to become a general. But he had no army. The plague had decimated the veterans of the Eastern legions. The treasury was empty. And then, Marcus took unprecedented and desperate steps. To raise funds for the war, he organized a grandiose auction in the Forum of Trajan. He put all the imperial treasures up for sale: golden goblets, precious stones, his wife's silk dresses, the art collections that Hadrian had gathered. He sold his own property so as not to raise taxes on a ruined people. For 2 months, Rome watched as the emperor sold his grandeur to buy swords for the soldiers. To make up for the lack of men, he resorted to measures the Romans considered shameful. He began to recruit slaves into the legions, promising them freedom, and also gladiators. "Arm the slaves, and they will save Rome," he said. By taking away the gladiators, he deprived the people of their favorite spectacles, which caused murmuring. "He wants to force us to practice philosophy by taking away our games." But Marcus stood firm. In the year 168, the 2 emperors, Marcus and Lucius, and the head of a hastily assembled army, marched north toward Aquileia. The sight of the imperial standards and the new army forced the barbarians to retreat beyond the Alps. Aquileia was saved. But that was only the beginning of a long war. The emperors decided to spend the winter in Aquileia, preparing for the counteroffensive. But the plague, which followed the army like a shadow, caught them there too. In the winter of 169, on the journey back to Rome, Lucius Verus suddenly felt ill. He suffered a stroke, a cerebral hemorrhage, and died 3 days later. He was only 38 years old. The death of Lucius was a heavy personal blow for Marcus. Despite all his brother's flaws, his frivolity, and his love for luxury, he was a partner, a man with whom to share the unbearable burden of power. Now, Marcus Aurelius was left alone. Absolutely alone. He was the last emperor. He no longer had a co-regent. His sons were still children. Around him, there were only enemies and death. The plague continued to blind his subjects. The barbarians in the north were gathering new forces to attack, and he himself was no longer young. He had fragile health and was an infinitely tired man who desired peace and books more than anything else in the world. But he had something the others did not: his philosophy. Stoicism taught him that duty is the only thing that matters. At dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, tell yourself, "I have to go to work, as a human being," he wrote in his diary. He returned to Rome to bury his brother. He organized a lavish funeral for him and deified him. And then he did what duty demanded of him. He took off the philosopher's toga and put on the paludamentum, the purple cloak of a Roman general. He took into his hands the sword he never wanted to use. In the autumn of 169, Marcus Aurelius left Rome and departed for the Danube front. He was going to a war he thought would last a year or two. He did not know that he would never see peaceful life again. It would fall to him to spend the rest of his days, 10 long years, in the damp forests and swamps of Pannonia, fighting for the survival of the civilization he headed. In the autumn of the year 169, having buried his brother and left a Rome plagued by disease, Marcus Aurelius arrived at the Danube frontier, at the fortress of Carnuntum, in the territory of modern Austria. He was 48 years old. He was a man of fragile health who suffered from chronic stomach and chest pains, and who had spent his entire life in libraries and palaces. Now, his home for the next 10 years would be a simple tent, battered by the freezing winds of Pannonia. His surroundings? Rough legionaries and the sight of the frozen Danube, beyond which began the dark, infinite forests of Germania. Thus began the Marcomannic Wars, a series of brutal and exhausting conflicts that historians often compare to the First World War due to their impact on the ancient world. It was not a war for glory or territorial expansion like those of Caesar or Trajan. It was a desperate war for survival. The Roman Empire, weakened by the plague, shifted for the first time in centuries to a strategic defense. The enemy was fearsome. Against Rome rose not a single army, but a gigantic coalition of Germanic and Sarmatian tribes, Marcomanni, Quadi, Jazyges, Vandals. They were being pushed south, toward the borders of the empire, by the great migration of peoples beginning somewhere far off in the steppes. To the Romans, they were savages, half men and half beasts, who knew neither fear nor pity. Marcus Aurelius, who had zero military experience, found himself in the role of commander-in-chief of the largest army in the world. And he worked a miracle. He did not play the part of the great general trying to imitate Alexander the Great. He acted as a Stoic, methodically, rationally, and coldly. He surrounded himself with the best generals, like Tiberius Claudius Pompeianus, whom he married to his daughter Lucilla, the widow of Lucius Verus, and the future emperor Pertinax. He listened to their advice, but the final decisions, often cruel and difficult, he made himself. The war was dirty and completely unheroic. There were no beautiful pitched battles in the open field, but an endless succession of ambushes, night raids, sieges of forest fortifications, and massacres in the swamps. The Romans had to fight not only the barbarians, but also nature. Brutal freezes when the Danube froze to the bottom and the impenetrable mud of the spring thaw. Marcus Aurelius, wrapped in a simple soldier's cloak, shared all the hardships with his men. He, accustomed to exquisite food, ate soldiers' rations. He, who suffered from insomnia, spent his nights poring over maps. The soldiers, who initially looked upon the Philosopher Emperor with skepticism, soon developed a profound respect for him. They saw that he did not hide behind them. They saw his fortitude, his calm in the face of danger, his concern for the wounded. They did not nickname him the Conqueror, but simply the Father. The most famous and mystical episode of this war occurred in the year 172 or 174, known as the Miracle of the Rain. The 12th Legion, which bore the proud name Fulminata, the Thunderbolt, was surrounded in Quadi territory. The barbarians cornered the Romans in a dry ravine and blocked all exits. It was a scorching summer heat. The legionaries, exhausted by thirst and wounds, were on the brink of death. They could not fight. They were collapsing from dehydration. The barbarians prepared for the final attack to massacre the weakened Romans. And at that moment, when there was no hope left, the sky suddenly darkened. A terrible storm broke out. A torrential downpour fell upon the Romans. The soldiers, forgetting all discipline, threw their heads back, catching the water with their mouths, and set out their helmets and shields to drink. But for the barbarians, that storm was a catastrophe. Lightning began to strike their ranks. Hail, the size of stones, mutilated men and horses. The water, a savior for the Romans, turned the barbarians' positions into a swamp, depriving them of their maneuverability advantage. The Romans, with recovered spirits, went on the counterattack and totally defeated the enemy. This event made a colossal impression on contemporaries. The pagans attributed it to a prayer by Marcus Aurelius himself to Jupiter or Hermes. The Christians serving in the legion claimed it was God who answered their prayers. Marcus himself, with his habitual modesty, simply accepted it as a fortunate coincidence that allowed him to save the lives of his men. On the column of Marcus Aurelius in Rome, this miracle is depicted as a giant river god, from whose hair and beard torrents of water burst forth, saving the Romans and drowning the enemies. The war continued, year after year. Marcus Aurelius methodically expelled the barbarians from Roman territory and then took the war to their lands beyond the Danube. He showed himself not only as a strategist, but also as a brilliant diplomat. He used the principle of divide and conquer, playing tribes against each other, bribing chieftains, and signing separate peaces. He made a controversial but necessary decision. Understanding that many lands of the empire had been left empty by the plague, he began to allow vanquished barbarian tribes to settle on Roman territory as laeti, semi-free farmer soldiers. They received land in exchange for the obligation to defend the border. Many senators in Rome criticized him for this barbarization of the empire. But Marcus saw further than they did. He understood the empire needed new blood to survive. By the year 175, after long years of bloodshed, it seemed victory was near. The Marcomanni and the Quadi had been defeated and recognized the power of Rome. Marcus Aurelius planned not only to sign a peace, but to annex their lands completely, creating two new provinces, Marcomannia and Sarmatia. This would have pushed the border away from Italy and secured the empire for centuries. He was one step away from completing the work of Augustus and Trajan. But the price of this war was terrible, not only for the empire, but for the emperor himself. 10 years of living in campaign conditions definitively undermined his health. He aged before his time. His face, which we know from the famous equestrian statue on the Capitoline Hill, became the face of a man carrying all the pain of the world. His eyes had seen too much death. He had lost many friends and companions. His wife, Faustina, who accompanied him in the military camps and bore the title Mater Castrorum, Mother of the Camps, died in 175 in the foothills of the Taurus Mountains. And the most astounding thing is that during all these years, amidst the mud, the blood, and the screams of the dying, in his tent, by the light of a dim lamp, the emperor wrote. He did not write memoirs about his victories. He did not write orders or laws. He maintained a dialogue with his own soul. In the pages of his notebooks, he tried to find the answer to the question, how to remain human when your job is to kill, how to keep calm when the world goes mad, how not to yield to anger and hatred toward enemies who betray and break their oaths. He wrote, "Soon you will have forgotten the world, and soon the world will have forgotten you. The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. It is a shame for the soul to be first to give way in this life, when thy body does not give way." These notes, made during the breaks between battles, were his only refuge, his inner citadel. In them, we do not see the emperor giving orders to the legions, but a vulnerable, mortally tired man who, every day, convinces himself to get out of bed and do his duty. The Marcomannic Wars turned the theoretical philosopher into a practical philosopher. Stoicism ceased to be for him a set of pretty phrases. It became an armor stronger than any Roman breastplate. He learned to accept death as part of nature and war as an inevitable evil to be overcome with dignity. Around the year 175, when victory in the north seemed already achieved, destiny dealt him a new blow, a stab in the back. From the east, from Syria, arrived news that was more terrible than any barbarian invasion. His best friend, his most talented general, the man he trusted most, Avidius Cassius, had proclaimed himself emperor and initiated a rebellion. Imagine this scene. It is night in a military camp of legionaries, somewhere on the banks of the Danube in savage Pannonia. All around is dampness, freezing cold, and a hostile darkness hiding thousands of barbarians ready to kill. In the center of the camp, in the imperial tent, sits an older, sick man. He wraps himself in a woolen cloak, trying to get warm. His body aches from horseback riding and from a chronic stomach ulcer. He is the most powerful man on earth, the master of Rome, Marcus Aurelius. Everyone is asleep. Only he is awake. By the light of a dim oil lamp, he dips his quill in ink and writes. He does not write orders to his generals, nor laws for the Senate, nor letters to his family. He writes short, fragmented phrases in Greek, the language of philosophy. He writes a book that has no title, no structure, and no readers. Later, centuries later, copyists will give this text the title Ta eis heauton, to himself, or, as we know it today, Meditations. But this is not entirely accurate. They are not memoirs. It is not a treatise intended for publication. Marcus Aurelius never wanted anyone to see these writings. He probably planned for them to be destroyed after his death. It is a spiritual diary. It is a series of exercises, mental workouts that the emperor performed with himself so as not to lose his mind. It is medicine for the soul that he took every night to survive in the hell his life had become. He was a philosopher thrown into a world of violence, and these writings were his way of maintaining his humanity when everything around him pushed him toward animal cruelty or despair. What did the master of the world write about? He wrote about how to be small, about how to be mortal, about how to do his duty without expecting a reward. The central idea of his writings is the concept of the inner citadel. Marcus Aurelius understood that he had no power over the external world. He could not stop the plague. He could not force the barbarians to lay down their arms. He could not prevent the betrayal of friends nor the death of his loved ones. But he knew there was one territory where his power was absolute: his own mind, his attitude toward things. Reject your sense of injury, he wrote, and the injury itself disappears. If you were insulted, it is not your problem, but the problem of the one who insulted you. If you do not feel insulted, then there is no harm. External events are neutral. Only our judgment makes them bad or good. Every morning began with harsh mental preparation for what he would have to face. When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. He knew the court and the army were full of such people. But instead of getting angry at them, he reminded himself, they are like this because they can't tell good from evil. But I have seen the beauty of good and the ugliness of evil. I cannot be harmed by any of them. He taught himself to see in vicious people not enemies, but sick and ignorant brothers, whom one must either teach or endure. Human beings were made for each other, so either teach them or put up with them. One of the main themes of his reflections was death. Death surrounded him everywhere. He saw mountains of corpses after battles. He saw cities extinguished by the plague. He lost his father, mother, brother, wife, and 8 of his 13 children. Death was his constant companion, and he learned to look it in the face without fear. For Marcus Aurelius, death was not a tragedy, but a natural process, part of nature, like blooming or withering. Do not despise death, he convinced himself, but welcome it, for nature wills it like all else. He often used the metaphor of ripe fruit. To live your time like an olive, to ripen, to fall, blessing the earth that nourished you and thanking the tree that produced you. He constantly reminded himself of the brevity of life and the insignificance of glory. That was his antidote to pride. He was the emperor. They worshipped him as a god. They erected statues of him. But in the silence of his tent, he wrote, Alexander the Great and his mule driver both died, and the same thing happened to both. He viewed history on the scale of millennia. Soon you will have forgotten everything, and everyone will have forgotten you. He saw the river of time that drags the names of kings into oblivion just as quickly as the names of slaves. Why then seek glory? The only thing that mattered to him was the present. Every man lives only this present time, which is an indivisible point, and all the rest of his life is either past or it is uncertain. In this present, the human being has only one task, to act correctly, to act according to his nature, that is, the nature of a rational and social being. His philosophy was a philosophy of action. The Stoicism of Marcus Aurelius is not a passive acceptance of fate while reclining on a couch. It is an active, courageous fulfillment of duty despite pain, fatigue, and revulsion. He hated war. He hated the roughness of camp life. He hated the bloody gladiator games he was obliged to attend in Rome, often reading documents ostentatiously during the combats, which made the plebs dislike him. But he did all this because it was his job. He was a bee in the hive, a part of the whole. To renounce his duty was for him equivalent to renouncing his human essence. At dawn, when you have trouble getting out of bed, he wrote, tell yourself, I have to go to work as a human being. Was I created to huddle under the blankets and stay warm? He forced himself to get up. He forced himself to go and command legions. He forced himself to dispense justice. This diary is a unique document. Generally, history leaves us external facts, dates of battles, texts of laws, descriptions of triumphs. In the case of Marcus Aurelius, we have an X-ray of the emperor's soul. We do not see a bronze monument, but a living person who doubts, suffers, convinces himself, scolds himself. We see how difficult his virtue was for him. His calm was not innate. It was the result of a titanic, daily, hourly work upon himself. He wrote these lines so as not to break. He was the loneliest man in the empire. He had no equals with whom he could speak heart to heart. His brother died, his wife died, his friends died, one after another. His only interlocutor was himself. And in that dialogue, he found the strength to keep living and governing. The Meditations of Marcus Aurelius is a book written without hope of publication, without the desire to please or convince anyone. It is the pure, distilled experience of the human spirit which, in the most inhuman conditions, seeks to preserve its dignity. The irony of destiny is that the empire he defended so desperately with the sword ultimately fell. The borders were broken, Rome was sacked, the statues were destroyed. But the fragile papyrus scrolls, written in Greek letters by the trembling light of a camp candle, survived millennia. The thoughts of the emperor proved stronger than his legions. And today, 20 centuries later, millions of people open this book not to learn the history of Rome, but to find in it comfort, strength, and an answer to the question, how do you live when the world crumbles around you? Around the year 175 AD, Marcus Aurelius found himself on the brink of physical exhaustion. A decade of incessant war on the Danube had sapped his strength. He fell gravely ill. In the military camp, where death was a frequent visitor, rumors began to circulate that the Philosopher Emperor had finally passed away. This false news, which flew faster than the wind across the entire Mediterranean to the east, provoked a crisis that nearly destroyed the empire. In Syria, acting as governor of the entire east, was Gaius Avidius Cassius. He was not a simple general. He was the hero of the Parthian War, an Iron Man, a severe disciplinarian who had restored order to the eastern legions. He claimed descent from the very Gaius Cassius who had killed Julius Caesar and prided himself on his hatred of tyrants. Marcus Aurelius trusted him blindly, calling him his friend and the pillar of the throne. Upon hearing of Marcus's death, Avidius Cassius did not wait for confirmation. In the spring of 175, he proclaimed himself emperor. Egypt, the breadbasket of Rome, and all of Syria immediately swore loyalty to him. Historians still debate the role of Marcus's wife, Faustina, in this conspiracy. Persistent rumors circulated that it was she who, seeing her husband dying and her son Commodus, still too young and weak, secretly wrote to Cassius, offering him the throne and her hand in marriage to protect the dynasty. For Marcus Aurelius, this version, if he knew of it, must have been a double blow: the betrayal of a friend and the betrayal of his wife. When the news of the rebellion reached the Danube, Marcus was alive. He found himself facing the nightmare he feared most: civil war. The battle-hardened legions of the Danube against the rich legions of Syria. This threatened to repeat the bloody chaos that had destroyed the Republic. Any other emperor, Nero, Domitian, Severus, would have erupted in rage. Heads would have rolled. Massive reprisals, the execution of suspects, and the torture of messengers would have begun. But Marcus Aurelius's reaction went down in history as a unique example of Stoic wisdom in practice. He did not rage, he grieved. He gathered his troops and delivered a speech that has been preserved in historical chronicles. He did not curse Cassius. He told the soldiers that he was willing to surrender power without a fight, if that was best for Rome. "I would voluntarily resign the imperial power," he said, "if I could be sure that it would serve the good of the state. For I continue to endure labors and dangers only for the common good." But he knew that usurpation would only bring blood, so he was obliged to march. At the same time, he gave a strict and incredible order: do not kill Avidius Cassius. He wanted him alive. "Let me," he said, "give the Romans an example of mercy they have not yet seen. Let me forgive the man who betrayed me." He dreamed of meeting the rebel, speaking with him, and sparing his life. The civil war, fortunately, did not happen. Cassius's usurpation lasted only 3 months and 6 days. As soon as it became known that Marcus Aurelius was alive and well and leading his invincible Danube legions east, support for the rebel began to evaporate. Cassius's soldiers understood they had made a mistake. In July 175, a centurion named Antonius, faithful to his oath, entered the usurper's tent and killed him. They cut off Avidius Cassius's head and sent it to Marcus Aurelius as a trophy and proof of loyalty. When the messenger arrived at the emperor's headquarters and presented him with the bloody head of his former friend, Marcus Aurelius turned away. He refused to look at it. He showed no joy. He wept. He said he had been deprived of the best reward of victory, the opportunity to forgive an enemy and make him a friend again. He ordered the head to be buried with dignity. But the most astonishing thing occurred afterward. Usually, after suppressing a rebellion, the purge began. The victor would look for accomplices, open correspondence, and execute the senators who had secretly supported the usurper. Into Marcus's hands fell Cassius's personal archive, chests filled with letters containing the names of all the conspirators, including, perhaps, many Roman senators, and maybe even the Empress Faustina herself. Marcus Aurelius performed an unprecedented act. He ordered those chests to be brought to the main square of the camp and burned publicly, without opening a single letter. He did not want to know the names of his enemies. "I do not want to know which of my friends are unfaithful to me," he said, "so as not to be forced to hate them against my will." He consciously chose ignorance to preserve peace in the state and in his own soul. He declared a total amnesty for all who supported the rebellion. Not a single senator was executed. Cassius's family was left untouched. They were allowed to keep part of their property and live in safety. This act of mercy was not weakness, but a manifestation of colossal inner strength. The Stoic Marcus Aurelius understood that violence breeds violence, and revenge is a chain that never ends. He broke that chain. He proved that his philosophy was not just pretty words for books, but a principle of real action. The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury. After suppressing the rebellion, Marcus embarked on a tour of the eastern provinces to restore order with his personal presence. He visited Egypt, Syria, Greece. In Athens, the spiritual homeland of his philosophy, he endowed 4 chairs of philosophy for Platonists, Aristotelians, Stoics, and Epicureans, assigning them a state salary. He wanted to keep the light of reason burning in a world sinking into darkness. There, in Greece, he was initiated into the Eleusinian Mysteries, the oldest and most sacred religious rite of antiquity, which promised the initiated bliss after death. What was the emperor thinking as he entered the dark temple of Demeter? Perhaps he was seeking comfort. For it was precisely on this journey, in a remote village in the Taurus Mountains, that his wife Faustina died, the woman he had loved his entire life, despite all the gossip and perhaps even betrayal. He mourned her sincerely and deeply, asking the Senate to deify her. In 176, after 8 years of absence, Marcus Aurelius returned to Rome. He celebrated a triumph, but it was a sad festival. The emperor was old, lonely, and sick. His body was failing him, and on the borders clouds were gathering again. The peace he had so painstakingly glued together with his mercy and his sword was beginning to crumble once more. The barbarians on the Danube broke the truce. The war he thought was over erupted with new force. The philosopher had to put on his armor again. In 178, Marcus Aurelius left Rome for the last time. As he departed, according to legend, he hurled a blood-stained spear into the ground in front of the Temple of Bellona, an ancient rite declaring war. He knew he would not return. In August of the year 178, Marcus Aurelius left the Eternal City for the last time. He was 57 years old. He was a profoundly sick old man, his body worn down by years of war, insomnia, and possibly a stomach ulcer or cancer. But his mind remained clear, and his will unbreakable. He traveled north to the Danube to finish what he had started 10 years earlier, to permanently pacify the Germanic tribes and guarantee the security of the empire. The Second Marcomannic War was a success. The Roman legions, guided by the old emperor, functioned like a well-tuned mechanism, inflicting defeat after defeat upon the barbarians. By the year 180, the resistance of the Marcomanni and the Quadi was practically broken. Roman garrisons were pushing deep into enemy territory, into modern-day Czech Republic and Slovakia. Marcus Aurelius was one step away from creating two new provinces that would have pushed the border from the vulnerable Danube up to the Bohemian mountains. It would have been the greatest strategic achievement of the century. But the emperor had one problem he could not solve with the sword, and that problem was named Commodus. Lucius Aelius Aurelius Commodus was Marcus's only surviving son. A handsome and physically strong young man, he was the complete antithesis of his father. He had no interest in books, philosophy, or the governance of the state. His passions were gladiator fights, chariot races, wine, and cruel amusements. For centuries, historians have blamed Marcus Aurelius for blindness. How could the wisest of men hand power over to such an unworthy heir? Why did he not choose, like his predecessors Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, and Antoninus, the most worthy man in the empire, and adopt him? They call this decision the fatal error of Marcus Aurelius, the end of the era of the adoptive emperors, and the beginning of the fall of Rome. But the truth is much more tragic. Marcus Aurelius was not blind. In his meditations, he wrote bitterly about how difficult it is to raise a worthy person. He saw his son's vices, but he had no choice. All his predecessors adopted successors not because it was an ideal system, but because they had no biological sons. Marcus was the first emperor in nearly 100 years to whom a son was born and survived, a prince, Porphyrogenitus, born in the purple during his father's reign. If Marcus had disinherited Commodus and named another successor, for example his talented son-in-law Pompeianus, it would have guaranteed a civil war upon his death. The legions, accustomed to dynastic loyalty, might have sided with the son. Marcus had to choose between a bad emperor, Commodus, and a bloody civil war. And as a Stoic, placing the good of the state above all else, he chose the lesser evil. He hoped the wise advisors he left to his son could guide him. It was a desperate hope. In 177, he named Commodus his co-regent, Augustus. Together, they departed for the front. For the soldiers, it was a strange sight, a gray-haired, emaciated philosopher beside an athletic but empty youth who was bored in councils of war and dreamed of the Roman arenas. In the winter of 180, in the military camp of Vindobona, modern-day Vienna, Marcus Aurelius took to his bed. Another outbreak of the plague had begun, and the emperor's weakened body could not resist. He understood he was dying. The scenes of his final days, described by historians, are full of stoic grandeur. He endured the suffering without complaint. When he realized the end was near, he stopped eating and drinking to hasten his departure. He summoned Commodus and his old friends and generals. He did not weep, nor did he ask for a miracle. He gave them final instructions on the war, begging them to see the matter through to the end. On his final day, March 17th, 180, when the tribune of the Praetorian Guard came to him for the night's password, Marcus Aurelius struggling to sit up in his bed, said, "Go to the rising sun. I am already setting." He was referring to Commodus. Then he covered his head with his cloak, as if isolating himself from the world, and slept the eternal sleep. He was 58 years old. The death of Marcus Aurelius was a shock to the army. The soldiers, rough, hardened veterans, wept openly. They had not merely lost a commander, they had lost a father. His body was cremated on a funeral pyre, and his ashes were sent to Rome and interred in the mausoleum of Hadrian, today the Castel Sant'Angelo. The Senate and the people unanimously proclaimed him a god. It was said that in Rome there was not a single house that did not have a small statue of him. But his fears came true almost instantly. Commodus, upon becoming sole ruler, did the very first thing his father feared. He was sick of the war, the cold, and the privations. He despised Marcus's strategic plans. He signed a hasty and shameful peace with the barbarians, renouncing the annexation of their lands, and rushed back to Rome to his beloved gladiators and orgies. The efforts of 10 years of war were thrown overboard. The barbarians, sensing weakness, understood that Rome could be blackmailed. The frontier became vulnerable again. And in Rome itself, an era of terror and madness began. Commodus, believing himself the reincarnation of Hercules, went down into the arena of the Colosseum, killing beasts and people. Senators were executed. The treasury was plundered. The Golden Age, the Pax Romana, had ended. The century of iron and rust began. As a contemporary of those events, the historian Cassius Dio would write, "The Roman Empire began its long, tortuous descent toward its fall." It might seem that the life of Marcus Aurelius ended in total defeat. The empire he defended began to crumble. The sun he raised became a monster. The peace he dreamed of never arrived, but history judged otherwise. Marcus Aurelius left behind a son that proved more worthy than Commodus. That son was his book. By a miracle that historians still cannot fully explain, his personal notebooks, written in small handwriting in a tent amidst barbarian forests, were neither thrown away nor lost. They were preserved. Perhaps one of his close friends or teachers saved them, understanding the value of those thoughts. The Meditations survived the fall of Rome, the dark centuries of the Middle Ages, the burning of libraries, and the shifting of civilizations. The empire of the Caesars turned to dust. The marble statues of Marcus Aurelius were smashed or melted down. The famous equestrian statue survived only because Christians mistakenly confused it with the statue of Constantine, the first Christian emperor. But the thoughts of the philosopher on the throne proved to be more solid than bronze and marble. His words on duty, on inner freedom, on the acceptance of fate, and on the brotherhood of all men became immortal. They consoled kings and prisoners, poets and soldiers for 2,000 years. Marcus Aurelius lost the battle for the preservation of the Roman Empire, but he won the battle for the human soul. He demonstrated that even possessing absolute power, one can remain a decent human being. That even in the hell of war, one can preserve peace of mind. And that true greatness does not lie in the conquest of the world, but in the conquest of oneself. In one of his final notes, he wrote, "Do not act as if you were going to live 10,000 years. Death hangs over you. While you live, while it is in your power, be good."